Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hi, Rob Tawab la Atam, Za Achikam Yawama Chagador Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam Kaya Malakat Hashemayim Kwa Rob. Repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call Layim La, La Abanaw Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Rachak, Wadashwa Mashana, Laza Kwanim Nawa, Wamalakim Shur Chagador, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Bon Sirach, chapter 30, and we'll get verse 14, and it says, better is the poor being sound and strong of constitution than a rich man that is afflicted in his body. So it's ultimately better to be poor and to have a body that's ultimately ambulatory. And when I say ambulatory, ultimately going into the ability to traverse and walk and have a body that's at balance, So reading it again, it says, better is the poor being sound and strong of constitution than a rich man that is afflicted in his body, So you'll have those with the example, Stephen Hawkins, he was rich, you see, but, when he was alive, he ultimately was afflicted in his body. He couldn't really walk and enjoy, the fruits of his labors. Verse 15, it says, health and good estate of body are above all gold, and a strong body above infinite wealth. So if you have infinite wealth and you have a multitude of gold, but your body is weak, you ultimately can't enjoy the riches that you've been able to get. It's just going to be a life full of woes. Verse 16, it says, there is no riches above a sound body and no joy above the joy of the heart. So it's a blessing to ultimately have a body that's at peace and without dis-ease. All right, because when you go into the word for dis-ease, disease, ultimately it goes into a body that's not at peace. So ultimately we should have a body that's at ease. And some things that help a body to be at ease is stretching, eating right, being in the correct environments, which we'll get some of that information out of Artazah. But I'm gonna continue on with these precepts. It says, there is no riches above a sound body and no joy above the joy of the heart. It says, death is better than a bitter life or continual sickness. It says, delicates, I'm going to skip down to verse 21. It says, give not over thy mind to heaviness. All right, pretty much going into depression. It says, afflict not thyself in thine own counsel. We're supposed to, put our cares upon the Lord. And then also, we have the brotherhood to ultimately receive of counsel. It says, the gladness of the heart is the life of man, and the joyfulness of a man prolongeth his days. It says, love thine own soul and comfort thy heart. All right, and ultimately what comforts our heart, which the Hebrew word for heart is lab. All right, which lab goes into the authority within, So we make decisions with our mind. All right, but ultimately how we comfort our mind is going into these scriptures. Isaiah 40 and verse 1 and 2. Let's go to that real fast. Isaiah 40 and verse 1, it says, comfort, ye, my people, saith your power. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received at the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So we ultimately was punished because we sinned against the Lord. So therefore we was placed into captivity. All right, and in captivity, in the world, Jake ultimately is, given over to depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, what eases that and what comforts that is ultimately these scriptures. That's why, the scriptures is ultimately known as, the comfort. The Spirit of the Lord, Yahweh Shai, is the comforter, and he comes in the volume of the book. All right, so nevertheless, continuing on, it says, Bon Sirach 30 and verse 21, it says, give not over thy mind to heaviness, and afflict not thyself in thine own counsel. Or I was at verse 23, it says, love thine own soul, and comfort thy heart. Remove sorrow from far from thee, for sorrow hath killed many, and there is no profit therein. It says, envy and wrath shorten the life, and carefulness bringeth age before the time. All right, reading it again, envy and wrath shorten the life, and carefulness bringeth age before the time. So excessive anxiety, anxiety, we're not supposed to be in the spirit of anxiety. I'm going to get a quick precept real fast. This is it's a lot. It's a scripture that goes along the lines of pretty much the Lord has given us the spirit of peace. All right. So going back into this, roughly paraphrasing, but it says 20 verse 24, envy and wrath shorten the life, and carefulness bringeth age before the time, So we're not supposed to be in the spirit of anxiety. We're supposed to be casting our cares upon the Lord. All right, and ultimately having faith, having confidence, because when you go into anxiety, pretty much you're worried about, you're pretty much in a spirit of worrying, and which, that ultimately goes into a lack of faith, because when we operate, we're supposed to be operating with faith. All right, we're supposed to have confidence. Con is with, fidence goes into fidelity, so with faith. All right, so we're supposed to have faith in the Lord, Verse 25, it says, a cheerful and good heart will have a care of his meat and diet, in which the meat goes into what you eat, and your diet is ultimately what you intake. So what you intake goes into what you allow yourself, the environments you allow yourself into. That's a little bit, well, when you go into the word for diet, it's it goes into the environments, that you're in, and what you allow your body to ultimately, to consume. All right, i.e. what you watch, what you hear, who you're around, what you touch. All right, and the things that you're ultimately, your lifestyle, So I just want to get some things that are ultimately beneficial and that would, pretty much have a body that's at ease. All right, and two of those things would be, how you eat, and then also stretching. So I put a quick AI overview search. It says how eating well and stretching affect the body. So it says eating well and stretching act as a powerful combination to optimize body function by boosting energy, increasing flexibility, reducing pain, and strengthening the immune system. A balanced diet provides essential nutrients to rebuild tissues, while regular stretching increases blood flow, improving joint mobility, and reducing the risk of injury. And that's why this truth is all encompassing, you see, because this is and pretty much this goes into, Bonsrat, the 30th chapter, being mindful of, the body, having a body that's of good constitution, having a strong body, Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, those that cleave unto the Lord are ultimately alive. All right. And subscribing unto the truth. All right. That's us cleaving unto the Lord, adhering, to the law, statutes, and commandments. And a part of the law, statutes, and commandments, is keeping these temples, all right, in a good working order. So it says fuel and repair. It says nutrients from a balanced diet repair tissues and provide energy for daily activities. It says disease prevention or dis-ease prevention. It says a healthy diet lowers the risk of chronic illnesses such as type 2 diabetes and heart disease. It says improved digestion, high quality nutrition, particularly hydration, supports a healthy metabolism. Impact of stretching, enhanced mobility. Stretching keeps muscles long, lean, and flexible, which is critical for mobility and preventing falls. Reduce pain and stiffness. Daily stretches reduce aches caused by inactivity, better circulation. Stretching increases blood flow and oxygen to muscles, promoting recovery. It says combined benefits, lowered stress levels. All right, because it went into, the envy and wrath and the carefulness. All right, so pretty much having a good diet or good eating well, and then stretching, that can lower stress levels. It says both techniques reduce stress, which can lead to better emotional balance and reduce unhealthy eating habits. Improve sleep. Regular physical activity such as stretching regulates your circadian rhythm for better sleep. And the circadian rhythm pretty much going to, or what Esau calls the circadian rhythm is going into like REM sleep, where you get that deep sleep, for better rest for the body to pretty much be to have the body to where, it's recovered. All right, to ultimately be more optimal for the next day. All right, it says better physical performance. It says a well-nourished body that is also flexible has a lower risk of injury. Incorporating these habits, such as doing stretches for the shoulders and lower back and choosing nutrient-dense foods, can lead to long-term improvements and overall well-being. All right, so I'm going to get one more precept and that'll be it. But this is Deuteronomy, Dabaryam, chapter 4 and verse 4. And it says, but ye that did cleave unto the Lord your power are alive, every one of you this day. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my power commanded me, that ye should do so in the land whither ye go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So when we go into the law, statutes, and commandments, they ultimately all have a reason and a purpose. All right. And when we subscribe to them, that's ultimately, again, how we show our adherence to, what the Lord is saying, because we're adhering and we're clinging unto the Lord. We're sticking closer, all right, ultimately by fearing the Lord. And that's ultimately what keeps us alive. And, keeping the body in a good working state also goes into the fear of the Lord, So just wanted to go into that. Adawan Tazaza by Naya Paulo as well as a beautiful edification through the spirit. Adawan Tazaza Atam Yashlay Latawablo as well. You have a good night. Wa Shalom Lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hey, Shalom, Shalom.